The history of the world has rarely been peaceful. Sadly, at one time or another, there have been battles fought just about everywhere, and most countries have experienced warfare. Whether fighting to form new nations, make laws, or oppose them, the instinct to go to war is a fundamental part of human nature. Yet despite modern-day attempts to have nations live together in peace and harmony, the great battles of the past have frequently become the stuff of folklore and legend. The ancient Greeks famously went to war over the beautiful face of Helen of Troy. The Romans built an empire based on war. And even the tales of Robin Hood are deeply rooted in the Crusades, which saw Richard the Lionheart fighting a holy war for control of the city of Jerusalem. However, the true cost of war fought long ago is often forgotten, as it was the victors who inevitably wrote the history books. But more recently, conflicts have actually been subject to much greater scrutiny. From the 20th century onwards, we've been better able to see warfare from all sides, and the two world wars, which shaped the globe as we now know it, between 1914 and 1918, and 1939 and 45, have a great deal to teach the human race. Ignoring the lessons of history has been the cause of many conflicts, none more so than World War II. And with the help of incredible archive footage, it's possible to build an accurate picture of how this war started, was fought, and concluded. Throughout this series of programmes, we'll be looking at the 7 years of World War II. The conflict, the build-up to war, the major battles, the strategies and technological developments, the effect on civilians, and most importantly of all, consider the role of the soldiers, sailors and airmen who gave their lives fighting for the freedom of others. The statistics from World War II to this day still make alarming reading, as it's generally accepted that this global conflict caused the deaths of over 50 million people, with 2/3 being civilian, killed as a result of bombings, large-scale massacres, starvation and hardship. However, unlike the Great War of 1914-18, which saw over 10 million military deaths, and many more million civilian casualties, the Second World War is rarely seen as mindless slaughter. The future of just about every nation and the way the world was governed depended upon the Allies winning the war, because if the outcome had swung in favour of Adolf Hitler and his Axis powers of evil, the cost to humanity would have been even greater. The war was not just a battle between nations and people, but of hearts and minds. On one side you had leaders who were obsessed by dogma, with little or no respect for humanitarianism or personal freedom. The big three were Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Benito Mussolini's fascist Italy. The notions of compliance, loyalty to the state, and a ruthless affinity for world domination obsessed all three nations. These were the Axis powers, and their worldview for a stronger future was one based on inferior and superior races. In fact, these were political ideologies in stark contrast with what the majority of right-minded people and governments believed. The forces that joined together to ensure that this new Axis world order would never become a reality were known as the Grand Alliance, perhaps difficult to reconcile with the Soviet Union's brutal dictator Joseph Stalin, who was extremely vicious throughout his regime, with a hatred of bourgeois freedom and parliamentary democracy, and he could never by any stretch of the imagination be considered a humanitarian. Yet, despite Russia being controlled by Stalin and agreeing to a non-aggression pact with Germany in the build-up to the war, Adolf Hitler made a huge tactical error, turning the Russians against the Nazis, and the Soviet Union played as big a part in the defeat of Hitler as any of the other Allied nations. War was officially declared on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German army invaded Poland. But the storm clouds of war had been gathering for many years before this. Europe had never enjoyed a real, lasting peace since the end of the Great War 21 years earlier. It had been described as the war to end all wars, but evidently it wasn't. Throughout this time of uneasy peace, the more liberal Western powers had, after the armistice that ended the Great War in 1918, much of Germany felt that their homeland had been completely humiliated and stripped of any national pride. At the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1921, Germany was held officially responsible for the war. The American President, Woodrow Wilson, joined with the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, and the French Premier, Georges Clemenceau, to come up with a series of measures to maintain peace and security for the future, and claim reparations from Germany to compensate the losses the Allies had suffered. However, although the Treaty of Versailles was not solely to blame for Germany's unrest, it was viewed by many as a harsh settlement that would inevitably hurt the German people rather than the military leadership responsible for starting the war in the first place. In the Grand Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, which modern-day visitors can enjoy in perfect peace and tranquility, Germany was forced to give up valuable industrial land, including the Rhineland, to France, Belgium, Poland, Lithuania, Denmark, and Czechoslovakia. The German politicians also agreed to complete disarmament and the abolition of all military service and the army, navy, and air force. But back in Germany, this earned them the title the November Criminals, and there was nationalist feeling abroad that the politicians had stabbed the military in the back. Through the 1920s, the German people faced terrible hardships as a result of the reparations the country was forced to pay, and they were constantly looking for a way out of poverty caused by high levels of unemployment. It was in this volatile climate that Adolf Hitler steadily rose to power, promising the people of Germany the hope of salvation. Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn in Upper Austria on the 20th of April 1889. Although Austrian, he served as a German soldier in World War I and was awarded the Iron Cross First Class. After the war, he entered politics as a fierce German patriot, and he infiltrated the German Workers' Party, influencing other like-minded soldiers to rise up against the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler was already a renowned orator, and he soon had a wide following, blaming the Jews and the Communists for Germany's terrible predicament. Soon he seized power as Führer of the party, and changed the name to the National Socialists, otherwise known as the Nazis. The German people were living in desperate poverty, so when Hitler spoke of the great need for Lebensraum, or living space, they hailed him as a hero. One of the outcomes of the First World War was the disintegration of the German Empire, and had the Treaty of Versailles been effective, it would not have been possible for Germany to claim any of this land back. In Hitler's semi-autobiographical book Mein Kampf, which he wrote while serving a prison sentence for a failed attempted coup, he addressed the people of Germany and promised the return of what had been lost. This was, without doubt, a man with big ideas for his adopted homeland, no matter what the consequences. And as he systematically removed any opposition, the outside world simply looked on. Hitler was obsessed by Lebensraum, and he was determined to rebuild the German Empire and expand it further still. And world events were about to take a turn that would make his case for German supremacy even stronger. In America, on October the 29th, 1929, the stock market on Wall Street crashed, beginning the period known as the Great Depression. This resulted in poverty and unemployment for millions worldwide, and Germany, already suffering terrible hardship, was one of the hardest hit countries. In a very short time, extreme nationalist movements became very popular amongst the people, with Adolf Hitler leading the way, promising that he was Germany's salvation if they followed his direction. When people... The warning bells were starting to ring amongst the architects of the Treaty of Versailles, but although unsettled, they chose not to take any action. Even when Hitler openly announced that he was breaking the treaty in March 1935, he was met with little resistance. Hitler decided that matters worsened when Germany's President Hindenburg died in August, at which point Hitler seized that office too, making his position unassailable. This in effect meant that Hitler could demand almost anything of his army, no matter how ruthless or cruel. Rights were being stripped from the Jewish community, and the Nazis opened the first concentration camp as the Gestapo were placed above the law. A terrifying new world order was becoming a reality, and something was going to have to be done if Hitler was going to be stopped. Driven by the desire for power and land, in the March of 1936, Hitler broke the Treaty of Versailles once more by marching his troops into the then demilitarized Rhineland. Astonishingly, yet again, all the Western world did was to look on in disbelief at what was happening. Many governments couldn't face the prospect of another war, and thought it better to allow Hitler to take the land, in the hope that this would be enough. As soon as Hitler's troops arrived, they began to rebuild fortifications, so that even if neighbouring France decided to take any action, the German army would be ready. The prelude to war was now well underway, and in Britain the voice of Winston Churchill could be heard warning the nation about the threat Adolf Hitler was now posing. Some thought that when Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin retired in May 1937, Churchill might succeed him, but the far less controversial Neville Chamberlain was selected instead. Even though wisdom is meant to come with age, Chamberlain was 68 at the time. He proved to be far too trusting when it came to judging character. He believed Hitler could be appeased, and made every effort to avert war, whatever the cost. But with nothing to stop him, Hitler continued to build his military machine. Not content with the Rhineland, in the March of 1938, Hitler forced neighbouring Austria into unification with Germany. The growing Nazi Party actually had quite a strong following in Austria, and when the authorities tried to resist the Anschluss, Hitler simply ordered his army to cross the border into Austria, where they encountered no resistance. After Austria, Hitler looked towards Czechoslovakia, and the rest of the world finally realised he would never stop in his quest for global domination unless they took action. Just as Winston Churchill had warned, the German army were now better prepared for conflict because from 1936 onwards they'd been building and stockpiling armaments. In fact, in this short but crucial space of time, they'd built almost 10,000 more aircraft than Great Britain, and over 18,000 more than France. Hitler really was gearing up for war. To make matters worse, Hitler was now looking eastwards, and the threat to neighbouring Poland was very real indeed. But Hitler knew that before he invaded Poland, he had to make sure that the Soviet side. Hitler assumed that he'd now meet with little opposition as he planned his invasion of Poland. The Western forces had done hardly anything. On August the 25th, 1939, Britain signed a formal alliance with Poland, promising to come to the country's aid if Hitler invaded. Hitler had first planned to invade Poland on August the 26th. However, word of this new alliance may well have made him more cautious, especially as his ally, Benito Mussolini, announced that Italy would remain neutral if war broke out. Mussolini and his army were not ready for conflict yet, and the Italian dictator even attempted to set up an international peace conference on the 31st of August. Under the agreement of the Anglo-Polish Pact, and a threat of revolt in the House of Commons, Chamberlain was reluctantly forced to give Hitler an ultimatum: pull out of Poland by 11 a.m. on the 3rd of September, or face the consequences. The deadline passed with no word from Germany, and with a heavy heart, just a quarter of an hour later, Chamberlain did what he had to do. In a radio broadcast at 11:15 a.m. on the BBC, Prime Minister Chamberlain informed the nation that as Hitler had failed to remove his troops from Poland, for the second time in 21 years, Germany was at war with her European neighbours, and on that fateful Sunday morning, a conflict began that would result in the Second World War. Almost immediately after Chamberlain's announcement was made, a siren was sounded in London, and many people hurried to find shelter from what they thought was the first attack by the Nazis. Luckily, this was a false alarm, although over the course of the conflict, that dreadful monotone sound would be heard throughout the country, spreading fear and panic into people everywhere, as the true horrors of war became all too real. Although too little too late, Chamberlain's government set about stepping up the war effort, especially in the light of the huge loss of life suffered in the First World War. The British wanted to be certain that everything was done to make sure that the conflict ended quickly and with minimal loss of life. From March onwards, after Hitler had advanced into Czechoslovakia, a programme had been drawn up in Britain for the mass evacuation of children from London and other major cities likely to be attacked by German bombers to the relative safety of the countryside. By the end of the 3rd of September, it's believed that over 500,000 evacuees had been moved. 2/3 of this number were children and their teachers, while the remaining third were women with babies or expectant mothers. The evacuation process was managed extremely efficiently. Each child was labelled with its name, address and school number. They all had to carry a gas mask, toothbrush, comb, soap, towel, nightwear, handkerchief, spare underwear and, if they had it, an overcoat. All the children were sent to railway stations, where they were issued with a blank ticket, as it was not known yet where their destination was going to be. The criteria was to get them out of the cities as quickly as possible before the anticipated air raids began, and it must have been a very traumatic experience for all concerned, not only for the evacuees. The people of rural Britain were expected to open up their homes to the children of complete strangers, but even at this early stage, everyone was prepared to do their duty for king and country. However, the first attack would not be an air raid over a city. It was actually many miles away out at sea. Within a few hours of war being declared, the Germans made their first strike against the Allies. At 7:45 p.m. on the 3rd of September, a German submarine torpedoed the SS Athenia, an ocean liner bound for Montreal. 112 people perished that night, as the first deaths as a result of the war were counted. But it wasn't all bad news on the 3rd of September for the people of Britain. Winston Churchill, who had so fiercely opposed the appeasement of Hitler, was appointed as First Lord of the Admiralty. There was great relief nationwide at this and others' footsteps into Parliament. When the message said, "Winston is back," it was because he'd been First Lord of the Admiralty at the time of the First World War. Always outspoken, Winston had made his fair share of enemies in the House of Commons, and when he was involved in the orchestration of the Battle of Gallipoli, a total military disaster for the Allies in World War I, he was made the scapegoat and stripped of his office. No doubt this contributed to Parliament's dismissal of his warnings about Hitler. But when he returned to the Admiralty in 1939, the people of Britain were very glad this great statesman was at the forefront of the war effort. After a flurry of activity, as curfews and nightly blackout precautions were put in place, nothing much seemed to happen immediately. The German bombers didn't fly over London. The British armed forces weren't sent straight to Poland, and no shots were fired in anger. It was all rather confusing, and many of the children who'd been evacuated returned home again. In fact, the biggest casualties came as a result of the blackout, because road accidents doubled as cars were not allowed to use their headlights, and there were no street lamps, so many pedestrians were injured as a result of falls. Nevertheless, strict rules were put in place for the blackout, and air raid precaution wardens, better known as ARPs, were appointed. They were mostly volunteers who enforced the blackout, and later, when the bombing started, staffed the air raid shelters as well. Early in 1939, the Military Training Act had been passed, which required all young men between the ages of 20 and 22 Yet all seemed strangely peaceful for a country at war. Apart from gardens being dug up so that people could start growing their own vegetables and air raid shelters being built, the streets of Britain looked the same as they always had, and the events of the last quarter of 1939 became known as the Phoney War. The Americans, who for the time being remained neutral, were also wondering what was happening in Europe between these warring nations. However, it wasn't only the British and French who were underprepared for war at this stage in the proceedings. Blitzkrieg, or lightning strike as the term translates, utilised the German tanks to invade Poland in great numbers and at incredible speed, sometimes covering up to 100 miles a day. The tanks stormed across the landscape, backed up by the mobile infantry in trucks and supported overhead by the screaming dive bombers of the Luftwaffe. The British couldn't help Poland until they'd built up sufficient armaments, so production went into overdrive. If the RAF were sent to fight straight away, then there would be no protection for the United Kingdom, and although the government were duty-bound to help, they still had to ensure that their home territory was safe from attack first. Ironically, the French did have the troop numbers to be able to make a difference. They actually had 90 infantry divisions compared to Britain's 10. And if they'd combined with Polish troops at the start of the German offensive, they would have outnumbered the invaders by 40 divisions. The Germans might well have been overcome if the French army had been ready, because on the German-French border only 23 divisions had been left for defence, with the Blitzkrieg demanding so many men. Unfortunately, the French army, despite being so large, was slow to mobilise, because the majority of the men were conscripts working 9-to-5 jobs in times of peace, but ready to take up arms when needed. It would take 2 weeks for these men to leave their jobs, put on their uniforms, and prepare for war, and they were just too slow. In those 2 short weeks, the German tanks and their Blitzkrieg strategy resulted in the occupation of Poland, at which point they sent their troops back to defend their German-French border. It was a crucial fortnight that gave Adolf Hitler a distinct edge. To make matters worse for the besieged people of Poland, 2 weeks after Germany's invasion, the Russians invaded, as agreed in the German-Soviet alliance, to take complete control of the country. There was little the Allies could do, and the few French that had fought their way into Germany were ordered back to guard the Maginot Line, a defensive boundary made up of trenches, pillboxes and large guns that ran along France's frontier with Germany on the west side. All the French could do was watch and wait as the Germans and Russians between them crushed Poland. Meanwhile, the British had opted for a rather different tactic to fight back with. The RAF were embarking on extremely successful raids all over Germany, making drops on Hamburg, Bremen and the Ruhr. However, these forays failed to cause one single civilian casualty. The RAF were not dropping bombs on the people. Their hulls were filled with over 12 million propaganda pamphlets. The hope was that these leaflets would influence the German people to demand a peaceful settlement to the conflict, pointing out that Hitler was to blame for their country going to war. However, from the mid-1930s onwards, the population of Germany had themselves suffered at the hands of Adolf Hitler, and an atmosphere of terror kept many quiet, who would have otherwise spoken out against the Führer. Needless to say, the leaflets did very little to sway German opinion, and in Britain, Winston Churchill vehemently objected, saying they were nothing but a waste of time and resources. However, the pamphlet drops did help in another way, giving the young British pilots vital target practice, because it wasn't going to be long before these airmen would be flying back over Germany with a much deadlier cargo. But for the time being, Britain wasn't prepared to begin bombing civilian areas, and neither for that matter were the Luftwaffe. At this stage, propaganda was everything, and as the war had only just begun, no government wanted to be blamed for thousands of civilian deaths. All the protagonists knew that the first to begin bombing civilian targets could potentially face a huge backlash in public opinion against them. The German troops on the ground in Poland had other ideas and weren't anywhere near so squeamish when it came to civilian deaths, and they soon established a reputation for brutality. On the 4th of September, over 1,000 civilians at Bydgoszcz in Poland were captured, lined up against a wall, and shot dead. The Nazi officers claimed that brutal guerrilla war had broken out everywhere, but the sad truth was that the German officers and soldiers thought that war allowed such brutality, and in 7 years of conflict, many more horrific crimes against humanity would be committed. As the autumn of 1939 gave way to winter, the war continued to remain largely isolated, contained well away from the public eye. Also, there were many countries with such pressing domestic concerns that they kept out of the fray, no matter how many lives were being lost in Poland. Most of Europe remained neutral. Some had vital business with Germany and chose not to put fragile economies at risk. Even America, Britain's most significant ally in World War I, with their vast army and huge natural resources of raw materials, wanted to stay out of a war so far from home in Europe. The American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, thought it in his country's best interests to stay on the sidelines. In a radio discussion on the 9th of September, he said that he'd seen war and hated it, and that he would make every effort to keep the United States out of it. Good news did come to the Allies from America's neighbour when the Canadians declared war on Germany on the 12th of September. The Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, wanted Canada to be a part of the war effort. However, he chose not to bring in conscription. Canadian troops had fought and perished in World War I, and Mackenzie King didn't want to force anyone to die in a war on foreign soil. Yet what Canada would supply in the form of raw materials, food, air training facilities, industry and convoy escorts would be of vital importance. This assistance from Canada, although essential to the overall war effort, like the rest of the Allies' early campaign against Hitler, was of little help to the people living in the Polish capital, Warsaw. On September the 27th, those who had bravely defended the city for so long surrendered as German troops poured into what was left of one of the world's loveliest old cities. It's estimated that more than 40,000 people were killed or injured in the offensive, and Warsaw was left in ruins. The Germans needed to take complete control of the land and air, because bombing the city was the only way to destroy Warsaw. They couldn't get their tanks through the defensive traps put in place by Poland's citizens, and with hand-to-hand combat, the defending Polish army proved altogether tougher than the Germans had ever thought possible. The only way they could overcome the Poles was to bomb them into the ground, with no regard whatsoever for human life, whether military or civilian. Matters were also made much worse because there was no food, water, power or gas in the city. The deadly disease typhoid had taken hold of Warsaw, and the consequences were horrific. A few days after the surrender, Germany and the Soviet Union created the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty, which divided up Eastern Europe into zones of either Nazi or communist influence. The first part of Hitler's blueprint for the control of Europe had been successfully implemented, seemingly with very little resistance from the Allies. At this early stage in the war, Neville Chamberlain's War Cabinet was still more concerned about forming alliances than fighting, and even Hitler was using this lull before the storm to build up his resources. The RAF maintained their propaganda pamphlet drops, while 500,000 French and British soldiers sat tight on the Maginot Line, waiting for orders to fight. The Allied leaders believed that they were still not ready to start firing, as they wanted to be sure they were fully primed. Unfortunately for the Allies, they were unaware that the Germans were also significantly underprepared for any counterattacks. Because of all the troops needed in Poland, they'd seriously weakened their defensive borders with France, and they didn't have a single tank on the Siegfried Line, the name given to the German defensive border, which ran along the boundaries with Western Europe. Also, there was only enough ammunition to last about 3 days. With the benefit of hindsight and wisdom after the event, the beginning of the war for many historians has been regarded as a wasted opportunity for the Allies, at a time when they had a good chance to overcome the Nazis. However, because the British and French governments were unaware of how poor the German defences were, in fact the Allies thought that the Siegfried Line was incredibly well prepared against attack. The phony war continued. If Prime Minister Chamberlain and his French counterpart had made the decision to send the Allied troops to Germany to fight, there might have been no need for a 7-year conflict. This proves how important quality intelligence is to a successful war campaign, in fact as vital as ammunition and military personnel. only reckless leaders would send their troops into a battle where nothing was known of the enemy's tactics or numbers, and at this stage for the Allies, caution was very definitely their watchword. Because of the months earlier, the first casualties occurred out in the Atlantic Ocean, just hours after war was declared, and the fighting on the high seas continued throughout the early months of the war. The notorious German U-boats, through the latter stages of 1939, appeared to rule the waves, and every day the reports came in of Allied shipping being sunk by these deadly submarines. HMS Courage, HMS Ark Royal, HMS Nelson, HMS Gypsy, and numerous other ships and cargo carriers had been targeted by the U-boats, and although not all were sunk, the Germans were successfully managing to control movement between countries by sea. The Non-Aggression Pact between Hitler and Stalin had allowed the Nazi occupation of Poland, but towards the end of the year, the Russian Red Army had an agenda of its own and began an attack on neighbouring Finland. The Finns were drastically outnumbered, and the Russians, adopting a similar form of offensive to the Germans, had hoped to take this Nordic country in a matter of weeks. But, just like the Poles, the Finns had other ideas. They were an extremely tough fighting force, and were determined to give their all in the battle against the Red Army, which would last several months. Even as winter set in, they were not deterred by the dreadful conditions. The Finnish army used troops on skis, camouflaged in white, to fight Stalin's army, and they inflicted terrible casualties on the Russians, proving that in the conflict ahead nothing was ever going to be a foregone conclusion. Apart from the action out at sea, throughout Eastern Europe and Finland, 1939 would end rather inconclusively for the Allies, as the people of Britain struggled to get used to the blackout and living without their children, and many wondered if the nation really was at war. Apart from the occasional German plane shot down over British soil and the news of the war at sea, very little had seemed to happen in the first 4 months of the conflict. However, looking at the bigger picture, things were gearing up on all sides, and this was just a prelude to the appalling bloodshed yet to come. All the people of Britain had to do was look to the east and see the burning embers of the destroyed cities of Warsaw in Poland and Helsinki in Finland to understand that the fighting and suffering was already happening. Sat down to their Christmas dinner. Soldiers awaited orders, and evacuated children put on a brave face for their first festive season away from home. They all listened to King George VI making a poignant Christmas radio broadcast to the nation. As 1939 drew to a close, the King spoke of the spirit of freedom and the need to risk all for its preservation. And over the coming years, many of the people of Britain would pay the ultimate sacrifice before the war fought in the name of freedom would be won. The new year would bring with it the fall of Norway, the Low Countries and France, and see the battle for Britain begin. And as this series of the War Diaries continues, you can follow the incredible stories of strategy, sacrifice, stoicism and courage in the next installment. As the clock struck midnight on December the 31st, 1939, and the world welcomed in the new year of 1940, people everywhere awaited the outcome of this second global conflict of the 20th century with bated breath. The leadership of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had worked tirelessly to appease Hitler and come to a peaceful compromise over his rebuilding of the German Empire. The phony war between September and December 1939, they had a great deal of catching up to do. If anyone had been in any doubt about the seriousness of the threat to humanity posed by Adolf Hitler, they were about to get a very nasty shock. Right from the outset, the German U-boats had been a deadly threat to shipping, proved by the sinking of the British liner, the SS Athenia, on the day that war broke out. The battle for supremacy on the high seas continued to become more and more desperate as control of the oceans was vital for all the protagonists. The movement of troops, raw materials and food depended heavily upon shipping, and for the people of Britain, an island nation, this was crucial. Although the warships of the Royal Navy were destroying many enemy craft, they were still being beaten by the might of the German U-boats. These submarines could surface and then disappear extremely quickly, speeding through the waters to creep up on ships and destroy them with a barrage of torpedo fire. Matters for the Allies deteriorated still further when it became clear that things were not going to be much better on land either. Hitler's invasion of Poland, which was the last straw even for those who'd supported the Nazi war machine's new style of warfare, commonly known as blitzkrieg or lightning attack, was an unbeatable formula, which continued to become more deadly as they perfected it. Finland were also tied up in a bloody battle with the Russians, and although the Finns were fighting bravely, it seemed inevitable that the Red Army of over 1 million soldiers would inevitably crush the 175,000 strong Finnish army. However, in Britain, things still seemed relatively quiet. No bombs had fallen on the major cities, troops sat tight awaiting further orders, and the phony war appeared to be continuing. But for Adolf Hitler, it was an extremely busy time, and when he issued Führer Directive No. 6, late in 1939, he was serving notice as to what he intended to do. An offensive will be planned through Luxembourg, Belgium and Holland, and must be launched at the earliest possible moment. The purpose of this offensive will be to defeat as much as possible of the French army and of the forces of the Allies fighting on their side, and at the same time to win as much territory as possible in Holland, Belgium and northern France to serve as a base for the successful prosecution of the air and sea war against England. The British government, still under the control of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, were reluctant to take the offensive, despite the pleas of Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty. Hitler and his Nazi stormtroopers had ended 1939 on a high, crushing any attempt at resistance, and if Britain and her allies didn't act soon, then 1940 would prove to be another great year for Hitler and his new world order. The beginning of 1940 saw a big change for the people of Britain that really did show everyone that there was a war on. Rationing was reintroduced on the 8th of January 1940 because many people had already experienced this sharing out of food in the First World War. Nevertheless, it still took some getting used to, especially as there were different categories for different types of food. Rationing was, however, essential for the war effort. Britain had to adjust to consuming less as imports slowed down with German attacks on shipping. The British people were also being encouraged to utilise their gardens to grow food for their families and become self-sufficient, which is where the slogan "Dig for Victory" originated from. The people of Britain were working together to do all they could, but in contrast, it looked as if the government were making little effort to win the war. The first positive action, Winston Churchill was one of the politicians trying desperately to get these nations to take to arms against Hitler in the fight for freedom, because he feared that if they didn't, then they too would be overrun by the Nazi regime. The Allies were also discovering just how quick Hitler's blitzkrieg could be as the Nazis advanced across Europe. It took far too long for them to mobilise their troops to get to the Finns, because as soon as they were ready in March, the campaign had ended. The Russians had finally broken down the resilient Finnish army and forced them to surrender. 25,000 Finns had died in the conflict. Yet amazingly, the Finns had killed over 200,000 Russian soldiers during the battles. The French leader, Daladier, had promised the Finns assistance and had failed them with the slowness of his actions. The consequence of this was his own people wanted him out of office, as he'd been discredited, and on March the 20th, 1940, Paul Reynaud replaced Daladier in France. Despite a large number of Britain's evacuated children returning home while all this was going on due to the apparent lack of danger, the conflict was definitely gathering pace. Food rationing was ordered in France. Many Canadian pilots and soldiers came to Britain to help with the war effort. Italy served notice that they would fight on the side of the Axis powers, and on March the 16th, the first British civilian to be killed in an air raid was reported. However, when Hitler announced open war out at sea, ordering his U-boat commanders to fire on any ship that sailed into British waters, even craft from neutral countries, it soon became evident that there would no longer be a continuation of the phony war. Hitler was really stepping up his campaign, and more worryingly still for the Allies was the fact that he was gaining momentum at incredible speed. Something had to be done, and fast. But for the British government, under the leadership of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, again, it was going to be too little too late. The Allies had decided upon a plan to cut off supplies to Germany, especially Swedish iron ore, which was crucial to the enemy, shipped out of the Norwegian port of Narvik. The French Prime Minister, Reynaud, wanted to seize the port of Narvik so that this could be prevented, and in Britain, Winston Churchill was a vociferous supporter of this plan. However, Chamberlain and the War Cabinet rejected the idea, although they did allow the Allies to place mines in Norwegian waters. Winston Churchill had been right about Hitler in 1938, when Chamberlain had talked of appeasement, but no one had listened then, and yet again Churchill's prediction was dismissed until it was proved to be correct when Hitler turned his attentions towards Norway. On the 7th of April 1940, the Nazis began their invasion of Norway and Denmark, taking everyone, except Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, by surprise. This attack was a risky venture, but they still had little time to mobilise their troops. The Germans swiftly took the city of Oslo and a number of major ports and airfields, although elsewhere resistance from the Norwegians was fierce. In Britain, the War Cabinet were horrified by what had happened, and when news reached the British people, the Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was blamed once more for not taking a strong enough stand against Adolf Hitler. Already well past retirement age, Chamberlain knew that the nation no longer had confidence in his leadership, so he chose to resign. Sadly, just 6 months later, Neville Chamberlain died of stomach cancer, aged 71, going down in history as one of Britain's most controversial political leaders. He'd done what he thought was best for Britain, perhaps without grasping just what a threat Hitler really was, something he didn't live long enough to find out. But the time for considering a negotiated peace had passed with Neville Chamberlain. What Britain and the Allies really needed now was a man of action, and fortunately for all concerned, just such a man was waiting in the wings. The House of Commons needed a total shake-up if they were going to move forward and step up the fight against Hitler, and party politics were put aside when a coalition government was formed. On the 10th of May, Winston Churchill, who'd always understood the threat that Germany's Führer posed, was asked by the King to serve his country as Prime Minister. On his appointment, Churchill said that all he could offer was his blood, toil, tears and sweat. However, not even he could have predicted just how soon this promise would be put to the test. On the exact same day of Winston Churchill's appointment, and the coalition government was announced, the Nazis invaded Holland and Belgium. However, this was far more than an extension of Hitler's plans to expand the German Empire. It was a carefully planned strategy that required the Allies to come to the aid of Belgium. The operation, which the Germans called Sickle Stroke, was extremely elaborate and could well have crushed the Allied troops. The evening before the attack, Hitler confidently told his staff, "Gentlemen, you are about to witness the most famous victory in history." The German divisions were split into 3 groups. The first would invade Belgium and Holland and hopefully draw many Allied troops to the north. Then a second group would attack the Maginot Line and keep the Allied troops occupied there, while the third group advanced through the forests of the Ardennes and up through Belgium to cut off the Allied forces in the north. With the Allies trapped in the north, the other German divisions could attack France with little resistance and quickly snatch power. The campaign started at 4:30 on the 10th of May, with the Luftwaffe bombing Dutch, Belgium and French air bases, while at the same time ground forces crossed the borders into Belgium and Holland. On the 15th of May, Holland surrendered, and just as the Germans had hoped, the Allied troops were sent to Belgium to provide reinforcements. While Western Europe was fighting the war in the north, the real focus of the attack was developing further south. A German panzer division with 1,800 tanks was edging through the Ardennes forest without anyone noticing. The Ardennes forest was virtually undefended, as the French thought it could not be penetrated, but the Nazis were proving just how wrong they were. The situation rapidly deteriorated for the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, and the Allied forces, as the Germans encircled them and pushed them towards the north coast of France. At the same time, the French-Belgian border was being overrun by Nazis as they pushed west into France at alarming speed. The Allies were completely surrounded. They couldn't break through the German lines, and it was no longer a case of fighting back, but simply a question of survival and the logistics of how to get the Allied soldiers to safety. Hitler increased his stranglehold and pushed thousands of Allied servicemen onto the open beaches of Dunkirk, where they had very little shelter and no protection from German air attacks. Things were looking extremely bleak, and for Winston Churchill, just weeks into his premiership, only a miracle would salvage anything from this terrible situation. Then, to the Allies' dismay and delight, Hitler, under counsel from his staff, ordered the panzer divisions to halt 15 miles out of Dunkirk. The German tanks had been the key to this campaign, and many either needed maintenance in the entire nation and served notice on Adolf Hitler that he now had a fight on his hands. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. As much of a miracle as the evacuation from Dunkirk was, there's no denying it was still a colossal military disaster that should never have been allowed to happen in the first place. Britain was facing a real threat of an invasion from Germany. And even though so many men had been saved, the roads of northern France were littered with Allied vehicles and ordnance. There's been much speculation about Hitler's judgment call over Dunkirk. Some think he was paving the way for peace talks with Churchill, while others believe he was so focused on reaching Paris, his attention wandered. Nevertheless, in the aftermath of the evacuation, his panzer divisions were storming through the French countryside at alarming speed. The French were totally unprepared, and despite fighting extremely tenaciously, they were no match for Hitler's heavily armoured tank divisions. To the horror of the French, to date, Mussolini had kept a fairly low profile, but now the Germans were in the ascendancy. He wanted to share in their glory, and on the 10th of June, Italy declared war on France and Britain. Nevertheless, Hitler told Mussolini in no uncertain terms to stay out of France until it was controlled by Germany, as this was to be an all-German victory. Britain tried to organise an Anglo-French union on the 16th of June, but it was too late, and even Prime Minister Reynaud resigned, leaving the newly appointed Marshal Pétain with no option but to surrender. Hitler always thought his country was humiliated by the original armistice, which ended World War I, and it appeared that he was finally getting revenge for the humiliation. The terms of the armistice were clear. Petain's government would remain sovereign, but northern and western France were to become German occupation zones, and Italy would be permitted to occupy areas of southern France. The French would even have to pay for the Germans' occupation costs, while 2 million French prisoners would remain in German hands. Hitler wanted to totally humiliate the French with this armistice, giving no compromises. Hitler believed that this is exactly what happened to Germany in 1918, and just 22 years later, he took his revenge. The short campaign between May the 10th and June the 22nd had been a complete success for Germany, bringing them control of France, Belgium and Holland, while pushing the BEF out of mainland Europe. The Nazis lost only 27,000 soldiers to achieve this, in contrast to the 120,000 lost by the French. So far, Hitler had relied on the strength of his panzer divisions to win his battles, reinforced by the Luftwaffe. But as he would need to be transported to take the battle to Britain. Hitler had little respect for France, and believed they would be crushed with relative ease. However, he was not so confident about Britain, because he knew the British forces under Churchill's leadership would be tough to overcome. Consequently, Hitler once again tried to extend his hand in peace to Churchill, asking that Britain recognise Nazi supremacy in Europe. By Winston Churchill of old, and must have realised there would be no capitulation by the British. Consequently, Operation Sea Lion was drawn up for the invasion of Britain, and Winston Churchill prepared his people for the trials and tribulations that lay ahead. He announced that he believed the Battle of Britain would start very soon, and everyone had a part to play and needed to be ready. So far, civilian casualties had been minimal, but that was all about to change, and there were some very tough decisions to be taken. The responsibility of leadership for Churchill required him to take swift action after the fall of Paris, and on the 3rd of July, Churchill ordered the destruction of the French fleet at Mers el Kebir in North Africa. Although technically the fleet was still under French control, Churchill feared that Hitler might well seize the ships to strengthen any attack on the British Navy. Tragically, 1,250 French sailors were killed in the mission, which took just 5 minutes to complete. The French were furious at what they viewed to be an unprovoked raid, But in Britain, the attack, although causing many innocent deaths, was regarded as a necessary tactical manoeuvre. Even the American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, applauded Churchill's brave move, and when Germany declared that Article 8 of the French armistice would be suspended, Churchill was completely vindicated. This basically meant that the Germans would have been able to commandeer the French navy to increase their own, but Churchill's quick reactions prevented this from happening, leaving Hitler with the demanding task of overcoming the Royal Navy if Operation Sea Lion was to stand any chance of succeeding. On the home front, the British were gearing up to resist any German invasion, with the war effort ranging from collecting scrap steel to over 1 million men joining the Home Guard. The women of Britain were encouraged to work in the factories as well as looking after their families, and production of aircraft like the Spitfire and the Hurricane went into overdrive. Other women went to work on farms as land army girls, replacing the men who'd gone to war to ensure a constant supply of food for the nation. Barrage balloons were hoisted up all around the major cities to prevent enemy planes from flying in too low, catching them in the strong wire and destroying them if they did. If Hitler was coming to invade Britain, the British would be ready for him, and whether mending and making do, digging for victory, or cooking up nutritious meals from the fields and hedgerows, the spirit of the people was as indomitable as it had been at Dunkirk. The royal work, it was an error of judgment that would cost him dear. British also had the distinct advantage of fighting on home territory, as the Germans had a much greater distance to travel before engaging the enemy, and fuel capacity was a major issue. What's more, the British could also detect the incoming planes with a revolutionary system called radar. Both the British and the Germans had been involved with the development of radio waves, although just before the outbreak of war, the British Air Ministry were concerned that the Germans were using this technology to develop a death ray. They approached radio researcher Robert Watson Watt for verification, but he assured them that this was unlikely and pointed them towards radio detection and ranging, which we all know today as radar, for plotting enemy positions. Consequently, at the start of World War II, a number of radar stations known as Chain Home were constructed along the south and east coast of England. On the 1st of August, Hitler sent out the order, which demanded that the Luftwaffe overpower the English Air Force with all the forces at its command in the shortest possible time. The targets for the Germans were planes, air bases and aircraft factories, because as soon as the radar system picked up the presence of the incoming planes, the RAF would take to the air to meet with them in the clouds. Although the Spitfire was slightly superior to the German fighters, the pilots still had to rely on their skills and wit to escape bullet fire and take the enemy down. Many people on the ground looked upwards during the summer and autumn of 1940 to see the skies littered with the desperate dogfights. Losses were heavy on both sides, and there was no indication of who was gaining the upper hand. The Luftwaffe kept sending fighters over to Britain, and the RAF kept utilising the radar system to go and meet them. Bombers were also being sent over from Germany to destroy the airfields, and in the south of England the bases suffered serious damage as a result of this. The bravery of the RAF pilots was really starting to make a significant difference, as typified in this account of a skirmish with the Luftwaffe. I was forced to retire owing to engine failure, but dived on a Ju-87. After a 3-second burst, it went into an inverted dive straight into the sea. My engine started again, so I went after another Ju-87 and attacked him before he was able to dive bomb the convoy. He dived into the sea at high speed. After this, my engine packed up for good. Fortunately, the pilot did manage to get back safely after this, and he flew again the next day, determined that the Germans would never be victorious. Many more tales of courage and valour can be found from this period, and without the bravery of these young fighter pilots, the outcome of the Battle of Britain would have been very different indeed. In fact, at the height of the skirmishes, on the 20th of August 1940, Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and delivered the ultimate tribute to the RAF, saying, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." British newspapers were reporting the plane losses like football match scores. Some days the Luftwaffe won, and other days the RAF. Pilots were being sent from all over the world to help the RAF from Canada, New Zealand, India and South Africa. Even though the Americans were yet to enter the war, there were also US Air Force pilots who volunteered to fly for the Allies. The radar system was also proving to be of major importance. The chain home stations could estimate how many enemy planes were incoming, how far away they were, and at what altitude. Although the Luftwaffe made a series of small raids on the radar stations early on in the operation, the British restored them within a few days. Also, radar-like signals were broadcast from other locations to cause confusion, and eventually the Germans stopped trying to bomb them, evidently unaware of just how vital the system was to the RAF. The battle continued into the autumn, and for 2 weeks between the 24th of August and the 6th of September, the RAF lost 290 fighter aircraft, while the Luftwaffe lost 380. However, for the Germans, over half of these losses were bombers, while it was the fighter planes and pilots that were essential to winning this particular battle, and with the RAF now facing serious pilot shortages, it looked as if defeat was just days away for the British. Then, just as had happened at Dunkirk, a change of tactic by the Germans opened a window of opportunity. The Luftwaffe pilots were ordered to stop bombing the ports and airfields of southern England to move inland and start bombing Britain's cities. With the benefit of hindsight, historians view this as a significant error of judgment, because with the Luftwaffe heading further inland, the RAF had longer to marshal their interception, while the southern airfields were allowed a much-needed period of respite to repair and replenish. One of the major reasons for this change of tactics was Hitler's desire to target Britain's cities in revenge for air raids on German cities, but this was all the result of a misunderstanding. A German plane being pursued by an RAF fighter dropped its bombs over London, and Winston Churchill, believing that this was a deliberate action, retaliated, sending British bombers to Germany. From the 7th of September onwards, the Luftwaffe headed for England to bomb London. Hitler was furious about the Allied attacks and was determined to destroy Britain's cities, and many believe that this cold-blooded need for revenge distracted the Führer and helped the RAF to recover. They were just as busy in the air, but when they landed they could rest without fear of bombing, and they took advantage of the situation to repair their equipment and runways. Hitler continued to step up his bombing raids, and the Blitz, as it was known, became a time of terror for the British. On the 15th of September, the Luftwaffe sent their biggest fleet yet. With 200 bombers and a vast fighter escort, Hitler wanted to bomb London into the ground. The RAF threw all that they had at the attack and destroyed 60 of the bombers, serving notice to the Germans that they were far from being a spent force. When Hitler began Operation Sea Lion, it was summer, and he truly believed he'd be victorious before the onset of winter. But without even completing Phase 1, his plans would have to change. Trying to invade Britain had become too costly. He was losing too many aircraft, his naval fleet was still being repaired, and the tides would not be right for a sea attack until the spring. Also, Hitler was beginning to look seriously eastwards, planning his invasion of Russia, and he needed to keep as much in reserve as possible for this major undertaking. On the 17th of September, Hitler announced the postponement of Operation Sea Lion. The battle for Britain had been won, at least for the time being. The brave pilots of the RAF and the tactics of ground control with their revolutionary radar system had saved the nation from invasion, and after just a matter of months in the office of Prime Minister, Winston Churchill had prevented Hitler from achieving a military goal. Nevertheless, the bombing didn't stop, with the threat of invasion lessening. Germany continued to bomb the nation's major cities, and London, Cardiff, Manchester, Coventry, Southampton and Liverpool all came under fire. Thousands of bombs rained down on the people during the nighttime raids. Hitler hoped that this would not only crush the major industrial cities, but also destroy the nation's morale as well. Evidently, he at last realized that the British wartime spirit was a force to be reckoned with. At the same time, the German U-boats were targeting the many ships bound for Britain, carrying vital supplies. If the Nazis could not take Britain, then maybe they could starve the nation into submission by cutting off food and resources, effectively keeping the British out of the rest of the war. Also, the bombings continued through 1940 and well into 41. But rather than achieving Hitler's aim, the attacks helped to unite the people of Britain even more. And as the raids got worse, the levels of public determination to beat the Nazis simply grew and grew. But the war wasn't just being fought in the skies above Britain. Further action was being taken all over the world. The Japanese had been fighting their own battles in the Far East, intent on being the superpower in Asia, but officially joined Hitler's Axis powers on the 27th of September. Agreed. This was, of course, directly aimed at the United States of America, a major threat to Hitler in Europe if they entered the war on the side of the Allies, while constantly watching the activities of the Japanese in the Pacific. Despite the fact that the Americans did not want to fight a war on foreign soil, President Roosevelt had an excellent relationship with Winston Churchill and the British, and was helping the Allies significantly. The USA had recently swapped 50 warships for a 99-year lease of British naval and air bases in the Western Hemisphere, and looking ahead on the 16th of September, Roosevelt introduced conscription. Now all Americans between the age of 21 and 35 could be drafted for military service. Although it would be more than a year before America would suffer a direct attack from the Axis powers, President Roosevelt was already prepared for what was to come. Elsewhere, the Italians were really beginning to step up their war campaign. They'd already taken part of British Somaliland in the Horn of Africa during the summer months, and were now invading Greece. On October the 28th, Mussolini marched his troops into Greece with the jubilant cry of "Führer, we are on the march." Hitler, however, was furious at Mussolini's actions, viewing this as a tactical debauch. The Italian troops were not ready for war, but Mussolini was inspired by Hitler's success and was determined to emulate it in the Mediterranean. As Hitler expected, the Italians suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of the Greeks, and on the 21st of November, the Italians fled the country. The world was now definitely at war, and as 1940 drew to a close, London experienced the full power of Hitler's Luftwaffe when over 22,000 firebombs were dropped on the capital on the 30th of December. It was a chilling end to the year, as Britain fought on alone, with Hitler's Axis powers growing stronger daily. These were dark times for Britain, and the rest of the democratic world, and as thoughts turned to what 1941 would bring, any hopes of peace on earth and goodwill to men seemed futile, while Hitler's reign of terror continued.